This video is called What Socrates Got Wrong About Poetry and Why You Need a Poetic Mind in Today's Age. So, we think of poetry as just, making rhymes or whatever. We associate it with predominantly hip hop music nowadays, or some kind of archaic, boring thing that's tedious to read, unless you're like me and you're into that stuff. Now, for the Greeks, they, particularly Socrates and Heraclitus, they saw poetry as a medium of influence of their time. Nowadays, we use the word poetry to be like really loose in the description of any kind of language that's beautiful. We'll call it poetic. We're very liberal with that term. But back then, in ancient Greece, it was a way of sensationalizing storytelling, and they thought it weakened the soul. So you could imagine that the most popular form of media for the average citizen was the oral delivery of things like the Odyssey and the Iliad. So stories about Odysseus or Achilles. You could think of it like the brain rot of their era, where these rhapsodes, as they were called, the poets that would deliver these oral traditions, these myths, they were delivering a sensationalized piece where they were highlighting these gods for their degenerate behaviors, like being extremely violent or sexual or jealous, and it was like a Tik Tok feed, if you will, where they were just rambling through, hundreds and hundreds of lines of this kind of gossipy God worship. And the philosophers of the time saw it as something that was weakening society. And we see the same thing going on nowadays. We see a weakening of the messages that are valuable in favor of trendy behaviors and, juvenile, sexualized youth culture, that whole bit. The main thing is they saw it as invoking pathos. This is their word for like the pathological emotions that can weaken the soul. And that was standing against the emerging philosophy of harnessing the logos. So for the Greeks, poetry was being created, or rather philosophy was being created despite poetry. Poetry was the early form of communication, and philosophy would be the evolved later ideas. But what's interesting is that if you were to look at Zen poets from Japan, and it would be 1700 years later, somebody in particular like Dogen Zenji would be very prolific in his writing of poetry, and would synthesize the use of language in that way to embellish knowledge, to embellish true revelation. And that's the kind of poetry that I'm talking about when it comes to harnessing your imagination toward things that empower your soul. So when you're faced with dark times, if you can say the right string of words that can harness your emotions to empower your rational action toward good and building something with your life, well, then clearly poetry has incredible utility. And it starts blending into what prayer is, which, if you read the New Testament, it's, a kind of a work of poetry. But that is in the English language, which has a different legacy than the Greek language. One could only wonder if the Greeks could see how English inherited the works of Shakespeare, William Blake, and Geoffrey Chaucer, or whatever his name is. They might see the value of poetry as an extension and a partner in, deep philosophy. That you might even argue that the highest form of philosophy is when poetry is in service to it. Or you might say the highest form of poetry is when it is being uplifted by philosophy. So for the English writers, the English poets, their tradition comes after philosophy had been disseminated and it had resurged around the time that Shakespeare was writing his poetry. And the big difference is that when you're reading Homer, you're reading a Marvel comic. You're reading a juvenile piece that's very it's fan fiction. Maybe there was some real heroes. I think Achilles was real, but when fanboys take a story of a real guy who might have done some good and some brave things, and they start embellishing it because they get high off of vicariously living through, this other man. It's a kind of voyeuristic thing. It's similar to wearing a professional sports jersey of like LeBron James or something. Like he's literally me, bro. Like, no. That's where poetry, storytelling, mythology is very basic. But when you have something like Shakespeare, you see poetry in a different light. It's an interior use of poetry, where's this soliloquy of Hamlet, where he's dealing with this kind of existential dread. You might say, in this to be or not to be speech, that's very like emo, is what you'd call it. Sad boy, if you're younger. Very doomer. But at least it's grappling with like some kind of rational apprehension about the emotions. Like literally the beginning of the soliloquy is about action, to be or not to be. Like what it's this existential question of like doing something about your situation. We could even pass that through a Socratic kind of lens that, Hamlet's facing a moment of like kind of giving up on certainty. And it's in those poetic moments where you're no longer certain, where you're most ripe for creativity and making your next move. So I wonder how many people have availed themselves of the rich cultural wealth that we have in the Western world to compare these models of thinking, these linguistic models of thinking, philosophy versus poetry, and then those two concepts as they evolve throughout time and space. I can't quote Shakespeare, but the quote you should look for is the one about the things between heaven and earth. And that's a very, very beautiful quote. It gives me a certain feeling, and that's kind of more important than even remembering the quote. There are more things between heaven and earth than in all of man's philosophies, or something like that. Very, very poignant that somehow poetry can always elevate to the top of artistic mediums, and that you see this all the time with like hip hop, that this clever spectacle of using the ego with this like rapid fire, catchy linguistic phenomenon of oral poetry can really create a influential individual. In terms of the average person can be easily influenced by hip hop and that kind of stuff. But what happens when we blend this philosophical poetry with this Socratic position of mind toward the goal of achieving freedom? And I would say that is the philosopher's stone, if you will. But this is a lot more about the feelings that you harness in the way you describe something uniquely in your own mind than something you perform. It doesn't have to make sense. This is like a really unique internal disposition type art form. And I'm here to say that, we have been gifted a very, very valuable set of traditions in the West that can arm you against all atrocities and trials and tribulations. Of course, the Bible is your go-to piece, in my opinion, but in any event, give it a try. Start thinking more poetically about the outlook of your life. What if there's a way to kind of engineer the outcomes of your life based off the whim of a deep, deep desire trapped into some very valuable, emotional, yet rationally oriented, meaning that there's a kind of visual reality that you're attaching to the meaning of the way you're writing. And none of this has to rhyme. It doesn't have to have any of the trappings of what you would traditionally call poetry. But I would say that YouTube is full of this kind of stuff. And that's where my YouTube journey really started, was listening to all sorts of these kind of creators way back in the day that had this bard type vibe to what they were talking about. In any event, the Greeks got poetry wrong, but they also got it right. allow yourself the time to write some positive, deeply positive, meaningful, like Shakespearean oriented things when you're in these dark times, and write from that place of ignorance. And you'll at the very least, be practicing a type of gratitude for your existence. So I hope this was helpful.